Caitlin, and I have a question for you. Is there such thing as a scientific method? In video number 2, we discussed the question of causation and explanation. But how do we arrive at our explanations? How do we move from our data to our theoretical observations? Is there a distinctive critical realist method? There is a tendency in social science, going back to at least Comte, that if we found the scientific method, we could make social science a truly empirical discipline, worthy of the name science because we're able to provide strict criteria and definitions of validity, meaning, reliability, and justification. If you were to pick up a social science textbook like Designing Social Inquiry, you would likely discover that there are 2 styles of research or forms of scientific method: deduction and induction. We tend to think of science as something governed by what we call the scientific method. This scientific method has been based upon 2 distinct forms of inference, induction and deduction. But let's take these one at a time. Deduction is an inferential logic that moves between a major and a minor premise. It clarifies what constitutes as a valid, invalid, or contradictory inference. That is to say, what makes for a valid conclusion. So what does this look like? The most widely used example since antiquity, though to paraphrase slightly, Socrates is a human being. All human beings are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. While this may seem irrelevant, deduction forms an important part in Karl Popper's influential account of science. It can be found in comparative historical sociology, in extended case method, and in positivist analysis. It's often used as the basis for research design, falsification, and if-then models of causation. But there is one important issue with deductive logic. Deduction only shows that, given certain assumptions, certain consequences and conclusions must necessarily follow. Deduction simply draws out what is implicit within these premises. But the premises may be wrong. They may be unfounded. They may be based or informed by problematic assumptions about race, class, gender, or sexuality. Nothing in deductive reasoning guarantees the truth of its premises. At best, it hopes to find anomalies that will test those premises. Whether it can or not has been a long-standing debate with no clear resolution, but it doesn't look good for deduction. Then we have induction. Induction is a logical inference in which samplings of experience or empirical data are viewed as offering strong evidence for a hypothesis, a conclusion, or the generation of theory. Induction attempts to walk the fraught path from particulars to generals. Induction is largely based on the idea that through the identification of regularities, frequencies, and recurrences, we're able to identify trends from which we can build a theory. But induction runs into a well-known problem of causation and correlation. Induction can only ever yield evidence or support for a theory or show that there may be something at work, but we need something more. Induction often attempts to resolve this methodologically by finding a criterion for what constitutes a valid correlation. Classically, we have the example of a p-value of less than 0.05. But this is still not a theory, but rather a statistically significant occurrence based on a criteria and categories that we have devised. Critical realism has been skeptical of approaches based off of induction and deduction, and any attempt to define the scientific method. Instead, it's in favor of abduction. Unfortunately, abduction is not easy to define. As opposed to induction and deduction, abduction is far more unsystematic. It's a logical inference that is conjectural or speculative, but seems to explain the facts. It's often interchangeable with the expression inference to the best explanation, and is driven by theory which recognizes the need to go beyond strict adherence to data and methods and concerns about variables. Data and methods are in service of the theory, they support the theory, but theory always moves beyond them. Data and methods are just the starting point. We need good explanations, which requires venturing beyond correlations. The philosopher Charles Saunders Peirce tied abduction to the experience of surprise. something new, puzzling, contradictory, unexpected, or something out of the ordinary. Our theories, explanations, and expectations are disrupted, and we look to rework or develop a new theory which is able to explain the new facts. Our dashed expectations provide an opportunity to develop new and better theories. Alongside abduction, we have retroduction. Retroduction is in many ways a synonym with abduction, but is more like the process of working backwards to discover the conditions, causes, processes, or logics that explain what it is we want to explain. It's literally almost a case of deduction working backwards. We might say that abduction is to induction what retroduction is to deduction. There is no question that each of these different forms of inference have their place, but the trick is knowing what that place is. Induction is helpful with identifying regularities and patterns indicating the presence of possible causes. Deduction is helpful with showing what our conjectures are implying. Abduction and retroduction are helpful in highlighting how we go about discovering, forming, and justifying our theories. This obviously has important consequences for how we go about building research programs and constructing explanations. Claire Dakota helpfully summarizes this with the acronym ART, A-A-R-T. That stands for abduction, abstraction, retroduction, and testing. So first we have abduction. With abduction, we strive to pinpoint where a particular logic has broken down. This can look a few different ways. It may be that there's a contradiction that needs to be resolved. That contradiction might be found in the literature itself, or perhaps there's an absence in the literature. It might be that our theories have become outdated, or that they were never right in the first place. It might be that we need to make analytic space for the multiple lived realities that were not accounted for or that were erased in our previous theories. In any case, we begin by moving between empirical data and the literature, shuffling back and forth between observations and theories to better understanding where that logic has broken down. So second, abstraction. With abstraction, we attempt to find and disaggregate the relevant aspects of our problematic. This often amounts to finding the internal relations at work. This means finding the ways in which certain things are inextricably and necessarily connected and not just correlations. Third, we have retroduction. Retroduction looks to find the causal mechanisms and structures which will explain why these things are connected in the way that they are. In particular, we're looking at how structures constrain and enable agents who are able to act back upon those structures to transform, reproduce, or elaborate them in creative ways. With retroduction, we're basically looking to uncover the conditions of possibility. So, what has to be true about the world in order to explain that which is under investigation. And finally, we have testing, where we look to adjust our theories through comparisons and further empirical and theoretical observations. We want to look at whether our retroductions make sense across different situations while also attending to the different contexts to see if the structural dynamics we identify do actually hold true. This is an ongoing dialectical and dialogical process. Of course, it's never possible to identify everything at play or to write everything up, but we're looking to expand our theorizing beyond a single context. The goal is not to posit laws, but to see how the context-dependent mechanisms behave across multiple sites. So where does this leave us? Moving beyond induction and deduction, critical realism suggests that through abduction and retroduction, our research programs need to be more theoretically oriented, and we can develop more robust explanations that couldn't be reached through induction or deduction alone.